Hello, I'm Robert, fact checker and science blogger. And this is something people are getting scared about with all the news. They're thinking, oh, the vaccines against COVID are going to stop working because of all these variants. And you need to watch out that there are lots of people who claim to be experts on the internet who really are not studying coronaviruses, for instance, and maybe their experiences with some other kind of virus, or maybe they're just a doctor and haven't really studied anything much of anything to do with the topic. And they are sometimes interviewed by journalists, and then whatever they said gets put up on the front page, and they're not necessarily the people who are best knowledgeable about these things. So I found a good article from the New York Times where they are interviewing people who are expert on this sort of topic, and I looked at a little bit of background research, and basically to explain the situation, then this is the spike protein you've probably all heard about, and this is just one particular paper I found to give the idea, and these were some of the things. They looked at 19 antibodies from 5 infected patients, and these are some things that these antibodies bind to. So this complicated spike is all needed to get into the cell. And there are all sorts of things on the surface of it that are functioning in various ways, and they all need to work like clockwork. They all need to work together in order to get into the cell. And so the antibodies, there are many things they can latch onto. And these, I don't follow the details of it, but they were just pointing about all this stuff, and these 19 different antibodies, and they're interacting in different ways, and they talk about how other researchers looked at other antibodies. And basically you've got numerous antibodies, and you've got a huge, very complex structure, and a few tiny changes somewhere in this whole spike is not going to change more than maybe just 1 or 2 antibodies. That's just the basic idea. I don't understand the science. I just know how to read the science paper. I don't understand the background of the science. But basically, so most vaccines work for decades. The measles, mumps and rubella has been working since 1971, polio since the 1950s, and flu is very unusual. You have to make new flu vaccines every year. You don't have to make new versions of the other vaccines every year. And these vaccines are mutating too. All vaccines mutate. So you look specifically at coronaviruses. Do coronaviruses mutate like flu, or are they ones that keep very much the same structure like measles, mumps and rubella and polio? And the answer is they're much more like the other ones. Although they are a respiratory disease, that's about all they have in common with flu. They infect the same parts of your body to some extent. They infect the lungs, the upper respiratory tract, the lower respiratory tract, but they are not flu. They don't remotely resemble flu. Apart from they don't even infect the cells in the same way. So you've got to look specifically at coronaviruses. They do resemble other coronaviruses. A quarter of the colds are coronaviruses, 4 out of 16. And so what happens with coronaviruses, and this particular one, it's got an error correction to it. And so it keeps very stable, going on from one when it goes into a cell and out, in and out, and a lot of replication. It manages to keep itself, it's a bit sloppy, but it's very sloppy, but it manages to correct itself. And most of the changes don't actually change the structure of the protein, they just change the virus, the different ways to encode the same amino acids. So you end up having the same spike protein, even though the RNA, that creates it has changed. So that's why it doesn't really change very much at all. So then we've actually got experimental data about this. And so this is one paper, and it looked at a different coronavirus, 229E. is the name of it. And they found, if you go back to 1980s to 90s, just some people with antibodies going back 3 decades. Well, no, this is not quite so. So between 8 and 17 years before their study, then whenever it was, then they found that some people with antibodies could not detectably neutralize the modern strains, though others were still immune to the coronavirus. So over a time period of about 8 to 17 years, we can expect some people to not be able to develop, their antibodies just won't work against the new strain, and you could expect that to happen with vaccines too. So it does seem likely that it's not quite so stable as polio and smallpox and measles and these things, but it's much more stable than flu, where it would just be gone over a year or so, or even less. So it's in between the two. And it's not likely. And then this Jesse Bloom, an evolutionary biologist, no one should worry that there's going to be a single catastrophic mutation that suddenly renders all immunity and antibodies useless. So we're talking about changes. It's a little bit more of changing than maybe the measles vaccine, but it's less, much less than flu. And over the timescale we're talking about of likely get rid of it in by 2021 to 2, probably we don't even need to update any of the vaccines over those kinds of timescales. Now, of course, they have to keep an eye on it. They have to be careful and look careful and say, is it perhaps for some reason mutating in a way we don't expect? Could it be that it affects more than just a few antibodies? But like for instance, the latest British variant, for instance, they checked with antibodies already, with vaccines already, and it doesn't seem that it's changed in a significant way. And it's really, the experts don't think it's likely. But in the very remote chance that it was needed in such a short time scale, I mean, it is being spread very rapidly through huge numbers of people, millions of people. But even so, it seems unlikely, because colds do as well, you see. They're looking at 229E cold, and just because it's very mild, but it does spread very widely. So it's just not lethal, it's not harmful. So it's still really quite a small percentage of the population, 5%, less than that, a few percent in most places. And so we are managed to keep it well down, with the numbers aren't that enormous, and the timescale is quite short, just 2 years. Over those timescales, most likely, we don't need to update any of the vaccines. But if we do, then actually, the way that the vaccine is designed, then they would just need to replace, they create the vaccines, most of the vaccines work by making copies of the spike protein. And so, if they need to, and they just sort of snip the RNA, from making the spike protein from the virus, pop it into their delivery system for the vaccine. So if the RNA changes in enough bases so they think, it's necessary to have a new vaccine, then they will snip the RNA out again and slip it into the delivery system, and they've got it down so they can do this. It's not as simple as just using scissors, but they can snip it out and pop it in just a couple of days for most of the systems. So actually making a new vaccine would be very quick, and then there'd be some testing involved, but most of the testing has already been done, and so maybe they'd have to do another phase 3 study, I don't know. They could probably test it against a copy of itself, so that would be much easier. So they would have the vaccinated with the current vaccine, vaccinated with the new vaccine with the spike snipped out, and then that would be much easier to do, because you're not risking anyone's health or life by doing that. because you are almost certain that the new virus vaccine is almost identical. I don't know what they would actually do, but but it's certainly it's not going to be such a complex process, and they do seem to think that they can do it quite easily to just snip out the old stack, put in a new one, and have a much faster process to get to the new vaccine, rather than you wouldn't have to do the phase 1 or phase 2. And I don't know what they would do for phase 3, but they would get the new vaccine pretty quickly if they did need to change the new spike. So basically, just don't worry about this whole thing. It's journalists making it gloomy in order to sell news. The experts don't think that it's a big issue, and I recommend I'll put this link in the description, and then have a look at the at this article in the New York Times. That is a well-written article with good sources. They've gone to good, decent sources, and so I recommend have a read of that, and hopefully that leaves some of your worries about vaccines and them escaping vaccines. And the people who seem to think that it's very likely to escape the vaccine, they're maybe a bit used to flu. It is a little bit, as I say, it does seem to evolve a little bit more than measles and polio, but nothing like flu. Flu is a very different virus. It's not a coronavirus. Oh yes, and the other thing I said is that flu works by mutating a lot, but coronaviruses, they work by hiding themselves from the immune system. If you get a really bad bout of COVID, then that actually does not protect you more than the vaccine. It protects you probably less than the vaccine. Because if you get a bad bout of COVID and you end up in hospital and so on, maybe end up in intensive care unit, then the virus is attacking your immune system, and it makes it harder for the immune system to recognize the virus in the future, or it could do that. The vaccine is carefully designed, just the right dose at just the right time. It's not going to infect you, it's not going to give you the disease. It's actually better than the virus that causes you the disease. And it's much harder for the virus to evade it, because the vaccine itself is not harming your immune system. And so if you're vaccinated, you've got most likely have a much better and longer lasting immune response than you do for the natural disease. Because the natural disease is the virus in your body for quite a while. It's got plenty of time to start messing about with your immune system and trying to hide itself from your immune system. And the virus itself has got these glycans that hide it, and then when it's in your body, it's going to do some messing with your immune system if it can, because that's the sort of thing that viruses like this do, if they can. So a vaccine is actually better than the natural immune response, and it's not likely that the vaccines need to be updated, but they are all ready on hand to update it if they need to. So please don't worry about this rather during this and Christmas Day, they just think, oh, Christmas Day, well, if we give them a good big gloomy story on Christmas Day, they'll virally share it. I mean, they don't really think. I think they just focus on trying to get the news as viral as possible, and don't really, the worst, the most, well, not even, even good quality news sources, you still have journalists whose eyes on the clickbait, and you almost sort of see, the kind of questions they ask of the World Health Organization. It's almost like you don't actually know how they're thinking, but it's almost like the clocks the wheels are going round for some of the journalists. What can we make this into to make it sound viral? And the World Health Organization are exceptionally careful responding to that, and they counteract and they sometimes actually say to the journalists something. They don't actually outright call them out on this sort of stuff, but they do say sometimes a bit about how it's important to be careful about how you report the things they say, which for the World Health Organization is a very blunt way of talking, to say even that much. And yes, the journalists often snip out the most alarming bit, the alarming sounding bit, and they don't put all the caveats and the other things and in particular, for instance, for these vaccines, they do. So the bit that they have snipped out is that they are checking to see if it is escaping the vaccines. That is just like due diligence. Of course they do that. Their evidence is that it's not likely to escape, but of course they've got to check that. They're not just going to run blind and just not even check if it's escaping the vaccines. Of course they've got to check and see if it's doing anything like that. But if you look at the science, it's very, very unlikely that it does escape the vaccines over such a short time scale, although it could happen over multiple years. And that, as best I can understand it, from reading the best expert advice that I can find on the internet, is the situation with COVID-19 and vaccines.